Good evening. I hope everyone is doing well tonight on this snowy night. We're going to spend just a few moments reviewing, or not reviewing, actually doing some new learning with some new steps out of Patton's book, namely steps 11 through 14. So I hope you kick back with a cup of hot chocolate and bear with me just a few moments as we learn about these new steps in the UFE process. Here are steps 11 through 14, and I know we don't always have a chance to read in depth Patton's book, and so as we're discussing these steps tonight, I'd like you to use the UFE checklist beginning on page 417 in your book. So step 11 is about ensuring intended users understand the potential methods, choices, and their implications. If you recall, in step 10 last week, that was negotiating appropriate methods to generate credible findings that support intended use by intended users. And so in step 10 last week, your intended users, they have to decide what methods they're choosing, whether they're appropriate, they're practical, they're cost-effective, they're ethical methods, and do those methods align to the questions that were generated by your intended users as a part of the evaluation process. So step 11 takes that a step further. And again, let's go back to page 417, and you can review methods also under step 10 with negotiating on page 416. But step 11 talks about making sure the users understand the method choices that they make and the controversies associated with that and their implications. So again, selecting the methods appropriate to the questions being asked. What are the debates that come along with those method choices? Does that involve quantitative decisions versus qualitative data, or a combination of both? There is that internal versus external validity conversation. Are there sampling approaches that are involved? So again, review the checklist on pages 417 and 418 in regards to the choices that primary intended users make and the implications associated with that. Step 12 are your primary intended users understanding the importance of conducting a simulation use of findings prior to the data collection. So before data are collected, a simulation of use is done with basically fabricated findings to provide a meaningful learning experience to primary intended users. So if we fabricated findings based on the proposed design and the measures of implementation and outcomes, what would that look like in terms of a dress rehearsal? So that helps guide the primary intended users in thinking about the methods that they chose. So it helps them to determine if there should be any design changes, any revisions or additions to the data collection process that would actually increase the utility of those evaluation findings being used, because this is all about intended use to create utility and use of the evaluation. So step 12 is talked about. It's not very complicated. It's just briefly summarized on page 418 as a part of the checklist. Once we've kind of conducted that dress rehearsal, now it's time to move on to step 13, where we are managing and gathering effective data collection to ensure data quality and evaluation credibility. And this begins discussion on page 418 of the checklist and goes all the way to all through page 419 and just at the top of page 420. So here, it's important to keep primary intended users informed and involved throughout all stages of the process, including data collection. And you're going to have those conversations with your primary intended users as to who is collecting that data. But it should be managed with use in mind. So it would be negotiated again with your primary intended users. And also, It would be letting people know that their effective data collection efforts are valued as far as contributing to that credibility and use. Throughout this effective data collection process, you're wanting to always keep your primary intended users informed, to keep them interested and engaged. As we know, typically our stakeholders on our primary intended users may not necessarily be the ones managing the collection of that data. It could be you as the evaluation facilitator. They trust you to do that. You might divvy up that process. You might have someone else in your school district who has more of a responsibility for ongoing data collection, and so you might utilize their expertise. But the important thing is to always keep the primary intended users in mind as to how that effective data collection process is going along. Once that data is collected, then it's time to think about how primary intended users will organize and present the data for interpretation and use. And that is step 14, which is on page 420 of your book. And it's also talked about on page 421. So it's important here, and I know all of you, through your experiences with data collection, I know you pay attention to this step because it's about ease of interpretation and not complicated graphs and charts, but more simplistic graphs and charts to make the data easier to understand. So Patton offers some simple checklists for organizing the data that again are aligned to your priority questions, keeping it simple and understandable, being clear about terminology and definitions of evaluation terms, deciding what's significant, and distinguishing always fact from opinion. We also have talked about this before, that it's important to involve users in interpreting these findings. We want to use multiple sources of data to triangulate the data, to help us give valid and reliable research findings, and we actively involve our primary intended users in making those evaluative judgments and recommendations. So read about that on pages 420 and 421. So this is an attempt to quickly explain steps 11 through 14, but I know you will go back to the checklist and go back to your chapters to give you more in-depth understanding about each of those steps. Here is an attempt to align the 14 sections that are required in your UFE project to the various steps and chapters in Patton's book. And I won't spend time going through each of the 14 sections, but I have created another recording or video presentation, if you will. It's only 11 minutes long, and it's called UFE Project Directions, and I will send you the link to that video, but it will walk you through explanation of each of these steps and the alignment of the steps to the various chapters in Patton's book, because I know there's been some confusion about that. Patton has 17 steps identified in his book, but yet we only have 14 sections in our paper because we've collapsed and combined some of those steps into various sections of your paper. So make sure you take a look at that video called UFE Project Directions. I hope that after you look at the video, UFE Project Directions, and you had a chance to listen to this presentation tonight, that you're feeling a little bit better on this continuum, that you maybe were here or maybe even down here, but that we're moving you up the continuum, up the steps to more success in the completion of this UFE project. So at least you're trying, you can do it, I will do it, so that we all kind of reach the same place and feel good about our successes in our UFE evaluation project. And we can all say, yes, I did it, and we can celebrate. So next week, by week 5, you should have conducted all of your surveys and your focus group discussions, and you should have a pretty good understanding of steps 1 through 14 in the process described in Patton's book and applied that to your project. For next week's discussion, if you could do the best that you can, reading pages 365 through 426, where we'll talk about Patton's last 3 steps in the process, 15 through 17. Next week, I'd like you to bring just a rough draft of your UFE project. I don't care what it looks like, but I'd like to see evidence that you are well along the process, because we know the following week is when our project is due. So your rough draft, whatever that looks like, should include sections 2 through 10, which means you'll be in good shape, because you'll only have section 1, perhaps the executive summary, which is sometimes the last thing that we write, and sections 11 through 14 to compose. And then we'll share with one another your progress on your UFE projects. This is the rubric again, and I talk more about the rubric in the UFE project directions video, so make sure again you pay attention to that other video that I've talked about. And week 6, this will be what's due. And I talk about that too, but it's a 10-page minimum project. A white paper is just a paper, and your paper will include 14 sections. And again, you can watch the video. It should include methods of data collection that we've talked about tonight through a combination of questionnaires and surveys, focus groups, and document analysis. The PBS model project in the Google Drive used 3 methods. And so you'll want to pay attention and make sure you review that. Charts and graphs are recommended in your project, and at least 1 focus group with results included in your paper. And again on week 6, once you've turned the paper in electronically, you'll have an opportunity to do a presentation. And that can be any kind of electronic creative means that you see would be helpful to our group, but make sure that that presentation is no longer than 10 minutes. So have a wonderful evening tonight, making a lot of good progress on your projects as well as progress next week. I will be available tonight from about 5:30 to 9:30. If you want to call me, you have any questions about your project, if there's anything you're not understanding in terms of the presentation content tonight, or just general discussion that you would like to have with me, I'd be happy to visit with you. All of you have my cell phone number. I'll include that again in my email. And again, wishing all of you a successful evening tonight, a safe evening, that you're all at home, comfortable in front of the fireplace with a cup of hot chocolate. I just want you to be comfortable, especially with the expectations for this project, but most importantly, that you're home safe. So have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week.